Okay. Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering the ABA's new rules on client due diligence, two new FCPA cases, whether it is a moral failure to leave the office at 5 p.m., and Florida woman's attempt to wash off DNA evidence using Diet Mountain Dew. Stay tuned. But first, Tom, how has your week been, and what do you think is the most interesting development?
I have to say, anyone that drinks Diet Mountain Dew, you have to question, not the real stuff, but the Diet Mountain Dew. If you're going to do Mountain Dew, go all out. But other than that, I was really interested with our first story, which is about the ABA voting to amend its rules on client due diligence. I have been very frustrated with the American Bar Association, who is our trade organization, over the past several years, largely because of their fight against anti-money laundering and their refusal to support the Corporate Transparency Act until 2020 itself. They did finally change their position on that, and they do now. They signed on with that, and that, of course, became law on January 1, 2021. And finally, now they've amended the rules on client due diligence, which would require obligations to determine and more thoroughly vet potential clients and try to stop the use of law firms' trust accounts to launder money. This has been going on at least as long as I've been a lawyer. And I can remember in the mid-'80s, people would want to park money in my trust account. Now, I didn't know anything about money laundering back then, but I knew something smelled wrong. In Texas, it was further facilitated because taxes aren't paid on money in trust accounts. Interest is not paid on money in trust accounts. So it can sit there for time immemorial, basically, and not really subject to even the most basic checks and balances, such as taxes, such as bank oversight, that you typically see in large amounts of money. But this is around client due diligence, and I can only say it's way beyond time for the ABA to get behind this. We've got several major issues right now. Probably the biggest is the imbroglio that Covington and Burling finds itself in with the Securities and Exchange Commission about releasing the names of its clients who were subject to a data breach. And it's not because the SEC wants to know who was damaged by Covington's data breach. They want to know if Covington's clients who had data taken reported that. And there's a diminution of the attorney-client privilege there that's going to have to be probably determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. So lots going on in the area of the legal world and its intersection with anti-money laundering, data privacy, data protection, and this is one more. But I don't know how you feel, but I just think this is a hugely positive step forward for the fight against money laundering and getting law firms to move into the 21st century on this, Kristy.
There's all kinds of interesting things about this. So, as I spent nearly a decade in London, and my first couple of years were at Gibson Dunn, and I was surprised and interested in the fact that they had a requirement under the solicitor's regulatory authority to have an anti-money laundering officer. And they had an obligation to not only do very strong KYC, but to report any suspicious activity that came out of that to the regulator. And it made so much sense to me. The fact that the new ABA rules don't go that far, that one of the major controversies was the idea that they would have to tell someone if they found suspicious activity that didn't make its way into the ABA rules. And the article itself really focused on how they did this just to avoid congressional or senatorial oversight. And of course, they may not, right? The Senate may take up lawyers' duties in this respect. I somehow doubt it. It doesn't seem like number one on their priority list, but it is interesting. I think the rest of the world is much more forward thinking, especially in the UK, than US's obligations on lawyers to do this kind of disclosure and to do the kind of due diligence you would think anyone would want to do on their clients.
Yes. So I think more is going to change for law firms, and we both lived under those regimes. And if Gibson Dunn can do it in the United Kingdom, I don't know why they can't do it in the United States.
Yeah, they certainly can, whether or not they're required to by the ABA. Stay tuned. Who else's life is going to change here is the Indian auditors. So we go from American lawyers to Indian auditors. And I think this is really interesting. This is from the FCPA blog. It's titled New India requires auditors to report suspected bribery and kickbacks to the government. Okay. So the new rules were issued by the National Finance Reporting Authority, and they require auditors that believe that fraud is being committed either by the company or on the company by its employees. It requires the auditors to report the potential fraud to the Indian government if the amount involved is above 122,000 US dollars. So the previous rule was that auditors had to disclose potential fraud to the government only if the auditor, him or herself, themselves, were the first person to discover it. So basically, if a whistleblower had reported the potential fraud internally, or if the company's management discovered it during their reviews, the auditors were under no obligation to report the potential fraud to the government, or bribes for that matter. Now the auditor is required to notify the government no matter how they came across the information or how the company learned on the issue. So under this new Indian law, fraud is defined quite broadly. So in this context, it includes situations where there is no actual wrongful gain or loss. And according to the FCPA blog's authors, this means that any investigation into bribery would trigger the auditor's reporting obligations, assuming that the concern is above $122,000. So the disclosure requirements relate to both government bribes and private bribery as well, which I found really interesting. Like the United States DOJ, the Indian NFRA would really like more disclosures from companies. They publicly said that regarding details of fraud by the company or on the company, because that would, of course, make their lives easier. So, Tom, this is really interesting to me. Number one, that threshold being so low at $122,000. And also the relationship between external auditors, even with internal auditors, potentially. How do you see this changing companies and their relationships with auditors? And this disclosure, do you think it will happen often? What's your thought about all of this?
I'm going to come in on the cynical side on this one. India is one of the most corrupt countries there is. And I just can't imagine an auditor turning anybody in India. It would be hugely positive if this was a change and a real thing. It sounds like a real thing. But I've seen too many cases involving allegations of, it seems to be a way of doing business in India. And I don't see leadership from the current administration in India. Maybe I'm off base. Maybe I'm thinking of India 10 years ago. Maybe this is a good first step. Maybe it's a first step. I don't know. But I think of the U.S. companies that have come to grief in India around FCPA violations. And I tried to overlay the article in your write-up around what would have happened to the U.S. companies involved. And it seems to me that the auditors that were utilized didn't have a clue. And so I'm just not it's not that I'm unenthusiastic. I'm just going to sit back and wait and see if anything really changes in India.
I think the pressure on the auditors is immense. And then you're going to get into is it a US company? I'm doing an international audit? And I think that there's going to be a lot of shenanigans with this, but it is a step in the right direction. And let's see what happens.
So you don't know this, but the name of this is Mary. This edition is Mary Wrote a Book. And so we're going to talk about Mary's book. And of course, by Mary, we mean our good friend and colleague, Mary Shirley. She has published now, as of August 15th, a book entitled Living Your Best Compliance Life, 65 Hacks and Cheat Codes to Level Up Your Ethics and Compliance Program. Anyone who knows Mary is not surprised by this. The only surprise is this is her first book by herself. The question is, oh, really? I thought there were many more. There was, of course, a book she and Lisa Fine did together about their experiences as the podcast host for Great Women in Compliance. So I've read the book. I've interviewed Mary about the book. I wrote a blog about it as well. It is a very useful, practical book for the compliance professional. It literally has QR codes in it that will take you to some hacks she has developed things that she has done, things she's heard you and I talk about. She really brings it all together. The one area, Kristy, that struck me because hadn't thought of it and I was only pissed at myself because I didn't think of it was when you get to November and do Compliance Week. Now, this is the celebration of Ethics and Compliance Week, not the publication Compliance Week. Think of it as a two-way street. Obviously, you can communicate more information about your compliance and ethics program. But what Mary emphasized is use it as a listening exercise. If you, whatever you do to celebrate Compliance Week, be there with compliance professionals just to listen, hear what people say, ask if there are any questions, ask if there are any problems. Do you want to go out and have a cup of coffee and talk? All of the things that we used to do when we were in person more often. And I just thought, why didn't I think of that? It's not always about communicating. I'm absolutely thrilled for Mary. You have been on this journey where you've obviously written several books now, and I have as well. And as we have all grown up professionally and in the field of compliance, each of us have been able to write in an area that we were either passionate about, wanted to explore, or wanted to communicate what we had learned. And every year, we weren't doing this podcast last year, but I can remember by this time last year, we had 3 or 4 or 5 great compliance books out. And we both talked about them in our own forums back then. And it's the same this year. And other people are getting ready to publish books. I won't name them because I don't want to take away from Mary's time, because this is her time in the sun, because it's her book. And that's a big deal to publish your first book. Kudos to Mary. Kudos for getting it out. On the one hand, it does not surprise me one iota. On the other hand, I want to cheer to the heavens for her. And I can't wait to see what she comes up with next.
Mary is fantastic. And yes, I blogged about it too, talking to her at brunch. And the fact that she hit #1 in Amazon pre-sales in several categories, that's just phenomenal. It really shows the power of the profession and the direction it's going. Congratulations, Mary. Everybody take a look at her book. It's really good stuff. Let's move from celebration to maybe not so much celebration with the next of our articles, which is relating to the second DOJ FCPA settlement brought this year. So this is the second one. Congrats, guys. It's also the 6th brought by the SEC. So we're getting there. We're up in our numbers here. I looked at Michael Volkov's discussion of the Corfico Colombiana and Grupo Aval bribery case. So let's just agree that I'm going to call it Corfico. Does that work for you, Tom? Is that good?
I couldn't even go that far. I'm Grupo Alva.
I like it. I've been working on it. Back to this case, though. Corfico's parent company is Grupo, and Grupo is a merchant bank subsidiary of the largest finance company in Colombia, and Corfico is a subsidiary of that one. So Grupo executed a bribery scheme to pay $23 million in bribes to Colombian government officials to secure a lucrative contract to create a 328-mile stretch of toll road highway, which interestingly enough was the largest highway construction project in the history of Colombia. So big project. Grupo and Corfica came together with our good friends, FCPA long-timers Odebrecht, to conspire to bribe executives and legislative officials, as well as executives at the state-run infrastructure agency. So the companies together will pay $80 million. About half of that has gone to the Colombian Enforcement Agency. But how did this happen? It's the usual routes: third-party consultants with fake contracts, invoices for work that didn't happen, success fees for intermediaries that paid off when there was a no bid and no formal tender contract and it was awarded. Has got a good deal, though. According to the prosecutors, they cooperated extensively, created strong remedial action plans, and beefed up their compliance department big time. So the DOJ awarded Corfico a 30% reduction off the bottom of the applicable guidelines in the fine range. Tom, this is classic bribery case, right? Third-party intermediaries beefing up the compliance program. Our friends at Odebrecht. What lessons can compliance officers learn from this one?
The lessons, Kristy, maybe for me came in a different direction. One, you mentioned several times and absolutely correctly, Odebrecht. Odebrecht was, at the time it settled, the largest FCPA enforcement action in the history of the world ever. It was later reduced, so it's got knocked off number one. And then, of course, we had Goldman Sachs and 1MDB. But it was a huge case. It reached literally up and down the Americas, North and South America as well. It settled in 2016. We are now in 2023, and we are still referencing Odebrecht. That shows you just the invidiousness of what Odebrecht had done and how its tentacles are still, companies are paying for it today. So that was really the first thing that struck me about this case. The second was we have both commented on the lack of FCPA enforcement cases over probably now 18 months. And I have, or others have certainly asked questions of the DOJ at conferences. And of course, we get the standard answer, just wait, just wait. They're coming, they're coming. And we see up and down numbers in FCPA enforcement. But when we get one, I think it gratifies us to see, yeah, they're actually still out there enforcing this. So that was really the second thing, that we still see an enforcement action. And I guess the third was the fine and penalty. It's not clear if it was actually a fine of 60 million real money or a fine of 80 million with a credit. And so it's an open question on that. Whatever that answer is, it shows that the DOJ will give real credit for cooperating extensively. And that's the message that I hope compliance professionals, I shouldn't say that. I know compliance professionals understand that message. I hope executives will understand, if you get ahead of this and you get out and you meet the requirements of the FCPA corporate enforcement policy, you're going to get real benefits. Even if you don't self-disclose, even if you can't get a declination. Last episode rather, we talked about Cognizant Technologies case. And let's just say a reminder, alleged C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme and a declination. So there are real benefits to cooperating. And there are real benefits, even if you don't self-disclose, to cooperating during the pendency of your investigation and remediating strongly. A good discount, a relatively low fine for what you and I have seen over the years. And yes, it's a classic case of bribery, but I thought they made a pretty good comeback once they made the decision that we're going to get ahead of this and do the right thing.
Fabulous. From old school Odebrecht to the new school messaging issues. What's going on over there, Tom?
So we had the SEC bring the hammer down, this time with the CFTC, a total of $555 million. I love the symmetry, for violations of messaging apps rules. Now, once again, these were regulated industries. So that's why the Securities and Exchange Commission were leveling this fine. This was against companies. It was not that these companies did not have policies and procedures in place. They did, and weren't followed. And that seemed to irritate the SEC a fair amount, and rightly. And companies need to get ahead of this, because if you're in a regulated industry, banks, financial services, broker-dealers, or insurance companies, you have a legal requirement in the regs to keep these messages. The SEC is going to continue to enforce this very strongly. We're recording this in mid-October. The SEC's fiscal year ends September 30. Kristy, we had a $2 billion month in September last year. It wouldn't surprise me if I have another similar month for a fiscal year end for the Securities and Exchange Commission. But there's a solution to this. And I did a compliance week. A guy named Chris Lehman actually got up and he gave the best presentation I've ever seen on messaging app compliance. And it's the following: have a policy in place, implement that policy through a procedure, train on it, monitor your employees, improve as necessary. Does that sound vaguely familiar to any compliance professional? It's the same strategy we use for any risk. Messaging apps are a risk, nothing more, nothing less. And when you see it as a risk, use your risk management strategy. So there's a way to handle this. It has not been done yet by these groups. And I suspect we'll continue to see regulated industries paying the price for this. whether it moves to non-regulated industries. Let's save that discussion for another day. I had that with Matt. That's an interesting question, but SEC, FTC are going to continue to aggressively prosecute companies who do not have compliant messaging apps, policies, and procedures implemented and followed.
I think that is the big open question, right? I think that it's very easy to look at regulated industry and say broker dealer banks obviously are being targeted. This is a very big SEC priority. Is this going to move over into the corporate world? And I think that's very much an open question, and it'll be interesting to see. But we have enough warning lights to make sure that you start to do that risk assessment on those messaging apps and get ahead of it in the way that Tom just suggested, the way you just suggested, Tom. All right, let's talk about something that Matt Kelly, our good friend at Radical Compliance, brought to us. And this is about stretching your compliance budget. So Matt was reporting back from a webinar that he moderated about stretching those tight budgets to maximum effect. His focus was really on getting the business itself to pull the compliance team in to help solve problems. Obviously, you can get better budgets if the business itself is saying, we need you to help fix this. And by telling compelling stories to help people be aware of how compliance can help. And he offered 3 specific solutions to some of the challenges with budget. The first one is using compliance ambassadors to help, obviously, with some of those human resource limitations. And the second one was to use an intern. And he suggested calling the local law schools to see if they could send over a victim who'd be interested in learning the compliance craft. And the third was to ask other business functions what they were already doing for compliance or how they could help. So one of the attendees shared that this question was answered by the company's learning and development folks, with the L&D lead telling the compliance officer they just happen to have access to a whole bunch of compliance related courses through their subscription with a training company that they use for their HR related cases. Excellent outcome there. And Matt finished the article by talking about the importance of prioritization that comes from taking that risk-based approach to the company's activities, which is always sage advice. It was a pretty standard article in some ways, but Tom, I really like Matt's commentary about the compliance ambassador program. So he took some time cautioning that these programs need to be properly defined to be effective. And I've seen more than a few ill-defined compliance ambassador programs where the ambassadors really have nothing specific to do, and the whole program just withers and dies a slow death. So I'm just curious, I know you've been looking at this for 1,000 years. What do you see working and making compliance ambassador programs successful or not?
I really think, Kristy, it is whether they are truly supported and whether they're honored. The employees who do that are honored for their work, whether that honor is additional pay, whether that is additional recognition. But if I've been in a situation where someone in Kazakhstan got an email from the CEO, congratulations, you're now our compliance ambassador. And they're like, WTF? 1, how do I do it? 2, when do I do it? 3, where do I do it? And
4, why do I have to?
Yeah. And am I going to get any support? And it really requires work by the compliance team and the compliance function to support those people. If your company has implemented one because of an FCPA or other legal imbroglio, usually you have management support and you can communicate that, but you've got to keep that support. Can't just start and not give it. And so to me, it's really about whether the compliance function supports it. You can't just send somebody an email and say, you're it. You got to support them. And it'd be nice if you could give them a little more money, or it'd be nice if you could give them a title, or it'd be nice if you could do something for them. And this is not the fire marshal. This is a real job. You've got to do more than get people to the right hallway. I guess the times I've seen it work is when it's actually been the corporate compliance function that supported the local compliance ambassadors to make it work.
Very good. We're excited because we have another foreign bribery probe. Tom, we got 2 in 1 episode. Given the dearth of these, it's pretty exciting stuff, man. Tell me about that.
So I was excited when I read the headline, and then I read further, and we need to hold our excitement a little bit.
Yeah,
be a little excited because the company Albemarle has agreed, they have said they have agreed in principle to settle an FCPA case. We have no announcement from the DOJ. We have no announcement from the SEC. The company is reserved, I think it's $218.5 million. Now, every other time we've seen a company reserve money, that generally means there's a settlement. But we have seen times when companies announced we're in settlement negotiations and regulators say, no, we'll tell you when we're settled. Hopefully, this is a case that will be settled. It is interesting. Unfortunately, we don't know where the bribery occurred. This came about through a investigation or something around improper payments in the Netherlands. And what is interesting is the Netherlands chose not to prosecute this matter. And obviously, Albemarle is subject to U.S. jurisdiction as a U.S. company. So the SEC and DOJ took a look into it. And that's what led to the purported settlement. So we don't know where the bribery took place. We don't know why the Dutch authorities chose not to prosecute. But it really does raise an interesting question, Kristy, of is the rest of the world still looking to the U.S. for leadership in this arena? 15 years ago, they were. 10 years ago, they were. 5 years ago, they were. In 2023, obviously, we've got Brazil, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Singapore, other jurisdictions have brought very significant anti-corruption compliance actions. And I don't know why the Dutch authorities, maybe they didn't have the laws, maybe they didn't feel like they had the facts, maybe they didn't feel like they could bring pressure, if any of this reporting is correct, and assuming it is. But I would really like to see the actual settlement documents, either the SEC order or whatever the DOJ NPA is, and really what the facts, specific facts are. And maybe we can come back and glean some true lessons learned. Certainly positive to read about it. Albemarle believes they've settled it. So hopefully they have.
You know, it's interesting to me, Tom. We were just talking about the $80 million settlement, right? That happened from all of this shenanigans in Colombia. And then we've got this one, which is more than twice as much, 2.5 times as much, that's been set aside for this non-prosecution agreement and SEC settlement. So I think it'll be really interesting to look at the facts and see if, in fact, there are things like that extraordinary cooperation really was the reason for the 80 versus the 218. I think this is definitely a stay tuned, because there's going to be some more details and analysis that we can have for this as we continue in on this. Let's go to the other side of the opposite, which is one that I really enjoyed from the New York Times. So this article comes from the opinion section, and it's entitled, "Leaving the Office at 5 o'clock is Not a Moral Failing." Quite a title, isn't it? The author is called Jessica Gross, and she reviews the new viral trend that has launched 1,000 memes called lazy girl jobs. So that is definitely one of those things that makes you want to stop and take a look at it. And she was quoting, and I had already read the Wall Street Journal article that interviewed some of the creators of this idea. And the Wall Street Journal described lazy girl jobs as, and I'm quoting here, "One that can be done from your home, comes with a chill boss, ends at 5 o'clock sharp, and earns between $60,000 and $80,000 per year, which is enough to afford the basic comforts of young adult life, yet not enough to feel compelled to work overtime," unquote. My goodness, what a happy, privileged life that is. The author of the New York Times article argues that the characterization of the lazy girl job is unfair. So what she says is, despite the inflammatory title, many people do want their jobs and they want to do them effectively, but they don't want to burn the candle at both ends. They don't want to sacrifice family and free time for their work. And she goes into some really interesting research that studies that people who have 4-day work weeks with 10-hour days are just as productive as their 5 days per week friends. And that pilot programs that incorporated options in Britain were continued by 92% of companies that offered this 4-day work week after the pilot ended. So she does note, of course, that folks wishing to run up the corporate ladder to executive jobs or roles that start with C, like Chief Compliance Officer, will need to go above and beyond for years to get where they're going, but that the average worker just wants to make a living, give the company its 8 hours worth, and then stop. And that this should not be seen as a moral failure, but as a more realistic way of making life work. So there's always a push-pull on this, Tom. Last week, I was on vacation with my family in Colorado, and I had to stop myself from checking my email because I have employees and I don't want them to check on vacation. I don't want them to feel compelled. And it's always toned from the top, no matter what, about whether or not you're going to be responding to this. So what do you think of this whole thing, this lazy girl office? Are you one of these attached to the computer all the time, folks, or do you find it okay to turn off? What do you think about any of this?
First of all, I work for myself. which means my boss is a complete jerk. No time off. He'll give me Saturday afternoon off if I'm good. So it's a very challenging. You and I grew up in a completely different era. And we both grew up in law firms and in a different era and the worst of the worst. Maybe investment bankers are worse. But I had years where I built 3,000 hours and was proud of it. And that's nothing to be proud of. And I work harder now than I ever did. I do what I love now. I talk to people like you all day, and it don't get no better than that. So somebody asked me what's hard about podcasting in a conference. I said, there's nothing hard about podcasting. Practicing law is hard. So I do what I love. So I work a lot, and I work 6.5 days a week at it because I want to. And I'm wired that way, and I grew up that way. All I can say is I understand there's a generational difference. And if I was a business owner with employees like the other person on this Zoom call, I would have to be sensitive to that. And I would just have to understand that whatever my values are, whatever my views are not held by others, or there'll be situations where they're not held by others. And I have to honor that just because I would want good employees around. It's difficult. It is impossible for me not to work, period, whether I'm on vacation or not. So that's just the way I am. But if you have a company and you have workers and they value things other than doing podcasts, you need to be sensitive to that because you're going to lose those employees. And I have heard more HR folks, talent folks say that talent acquisition and retention will be the biggest corporate differentiator by 2030. It ain't ChatGPT that's going to be the change. It's people who can work with ChatGPT. And if you can't work with ChatGPT and AI, you are going to lose out and you will not be able to get the prime job. So it's that talent. And if the generation of my daughter says, my value is to work 40 hours, I will give you a solid 40. I may be at home 3 days of those days. I may be at home 4 of those days. I will be in the office occasionally, but I will get my work done. Companies are going to have to accept that, not the other way around, where employees go back to what I did and probably what you did as a young lawyer. And, you know, the horror stories you read about investment bankers. When somebody leaves at 11 and the managing director says, oh, I see you're leaving at 11, you have capacity.
Yeah.
I mean, you're much more attuned to that because you have employees.
Yeah. And I think that's right. But I also think that living in Europe really changed my mind about that. There's so many people in European companies that really do work very hard for 8 hours a day and then really do turn off. And I made it a point in my own company to say, I'm not going to micromanage you. You can, as long as you get your work done, I don't care how long or how you do it. I care that it gets done. And I think that's the way of the future, genuinely. I think if you're, like you said, if you want high talent people, you've got to work with who's coming to you and make it a pleasant environment so they stick around, because that's really important.
Next, we have an article from a dear friend of mine named Jim Deloach. And for those who don't know Jim Deloach, he is truly one of the top thought leaders in a profession adjacent to ours. He's an internal auditor and a CPA and an internal control expert, a COSO expert, and writes in a wide variety of areas. And Kristy, he wrote one of the most interesting, even perhaps provocative pieces, and it's entitled, With Capitalism at an Inflection Point, It's Fair to Ask, What is the Purpose of a Corporation? I found he did 2 things for me in this article, Kristy. He summarized the arguments around, number 1, the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of corporation. Number 2, a wider discussion around ESG, and then articulated his vision that these 2 things incorporate concepts that make corporations more profitable. Yes, better run, but at the end of the day, more profitable. And Kristy, I talked to a lot of people around ESG, and I saw ESG as a way to take disparate data and information silos in an organization, from environmental to sustainable to governance, and put those together under the tutelage of a chief sustainability officer, a committee, perhaps the board. And you and I both advocated that the compliance function needed to take that lead. But it was putting these business processes under the purview of one person, one department, one committee, and having a much broader picture of what your corporation's costs were and how the efficiencies could be generated. Can't get those efficiencies unless you measure. And in the environmental, that's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Nothing wrong with measuring those data points to make you more efficient. Well, I thought Jim took that argument that I had made a step, 10 steps further, because he said when you integrate those and overlay that with the business roundtable's 5 stakeholders in a corporation, you begin to see the power of data and information put together with other groups who can use that information. And from the business roundtable, those groups were employees, those groups were customers, those groups were vendors, those groups were localities where you're doing business, as well as shareholders, so that you have more information being utilized with a broader subset of people in and for a corporation, and you can make it stronger and more profitable. And he cited to Marty Lipman, one of, if not the top corporate governance lawyer in America, one of the very top, who even said that this is essentially Caremark, because it is a reporting system to the board of reasonable assurance to management and the board that they're receiving timely information that should inform all of their decisions, so that it's information for decision by people who have a much broader view with stakeholders in a much broader sense. I thought Jim really articulated a true vision that is where not only where we're going, but companies are beginning to see this as a way that they can become more profitable. And for all of the political commentary around ESG, all of those anti-woke folks are missing. This is a business process that's making companies better, because companies are getting better information, and that's leading to better corporate governance. And who's against better information, better efficiency, and better corporate governance?
I liked the article. I thought it was really intelligently done. Now it's my turn to be slightly cynical. I do think that the pressure between the short-termism that continues to, I think, dominate, despite the 181 CEOs that signed on to the multi-stakeholder vision of corporations, that short-termism and that political push stuff really continues to have a lot of ability to sway the outcomes. But I do agree with him that over time, the longer termism of getting the other stakeholders, the customers, the people who aren't just the shareholders involved and caring, will ultimately create better innovation and better products. So I'm on his side. I'm on team him for sure, 100%. So shall we wrap up, Tom, with Florida?
No, with Florida woman.
Florida woman, not Florida man. So Tom texted me while I was on vacation in Colorado with my family to say, look at this Florida woman, and it was far too good not to bring in. Tom found our Florida woman because this is an equal opportunity podcast for all genders of Floridians engaged in making bad choices. So our Florida woman is named Nicole Max. Her roommate was found killed, not ideal. Unfortunately for her, the scene of the crime included her cell phone with a bloodied knife balanced on top of it. So that's never a good start. When the police found her a couple of hours later, she had blood on her clothes. And during the interrogation at the police station, she asked for a Diet Mountain Dew. And when she was, as the police described, procrastinating with the drink, the police tried to pull her can away. She then poured the can of soda all over her body and hair in an attempt to wash away the DNA evidence on her body. The article about this in the New York Post said that while artificial sweeteners such as the one found in Diet Mountain Dew can in fact break down the genetic material that makes up DNA over long periods of time, it is unlikely that dousing oneself in soda would eliminate forensic evidence. Tom, thank you for providing the balance for Florida man, and we promise we will stay on the lookout for more Floridian awesomeness for next time.
I can't think of a better way to end this podcast than thank you, Florida woman.
Thank you, Florida woman. Take care. I'm Kristy Grant-Hart. This is Tom Fox. We'll talk to you soon.